Marketer of the Day, number 453. Heatmaps, Scrollmaps, Analytics, User Testing, A/B Testing, and Troubleshooting. Increase your e-commerce website profits with conversion consultant Nick Disabato. Hey everyone, thanks for listening. We're talking right now with Nick Disabato, and Nick is a designer and a writer, and he runs Draft, which you can find at draft.nu, which is a small consultancy that focuses on research-driven A/B testing for online stores. So Nick, glad to be talking to you.
Hey there, happy to be here.
Super great. So this Draft consultancy that you run, can you tell us all about it and what it is that makes you guys different and special?
Well, I have an interaction design background, so that differentiates me from probably most other CRO agencies. I spend a lot of time interviewing users, doing a lot of research, and that's the sort of stuff that I've been doing for about 10 and a half years now. A lot of people come into this field more from a marketing background or sales background. There's nothing wrong with that. But that's what makes me different, is that I focus predominantly as a designer on design problems and use those to increase revenue for online stores.
Okay, great. And so, what sorts of design and user experience are we talking? Are we talking like heat maps and click maps or something more involved?
Both. I spend a lot of time looking at analytics, doing heat maps, scroll maps, behavior recordings. I spend a lot of time running usability tests on sites like usertesting.com, where people complete various tasks and vocalize their internal monologue as they're going through it. There's a lot of getting actual users on the phone and asking them non-leading questions about how they found out about the product and what competitors they considered and what held them back from purchasing. There's a lot of kind of both quantitative and qualitative insight that comes out of those things, right? Like you can run a survey of people and you're getting basically quantitative insight, or you could run a survey and ask very open-ended questions like, how did you feel about your purchase today? Get very qualitative insight. Both of those matter, right? There's the numbers side of things, whether a conversion rate is increasing, whether people are hitting the right element on a page, but there's also kind of the motivations, the stories behind how people are actually finding out about this, what they're using your product for, how it's fitting into their lives, whether they stopped using it at any point, whether they recommended it to friends. And those things matter tremendously for the kind of pitch that you craft, the kind of objections you're trying to address on a marketing page, what kind of terms you're providing, such as like shipping or trials or something like that. So all of those things matter for the actual design decisions that you're putting together, which I usually A/B test, and I'm using research to kind of drive that process.
Okay, interesting. And as you're explaining this, it sounds almost like overwhelming, and at the same time, it could be sort of tedious, right? Because on one hand, there's all this data to sift through and all these decisions to be made, and on the other hand, I imagine maybe it gets kind of aggravating just to figure out, okay, this button needs to be centered or a different color. So is there any of that of being overwhelmed and maybe kind of bored at the same time and going through all these piles of data?
With heat maps, it's pretty easy, right? You can look at one image and pretty much determine what people are looking at and not looking at. That's pretty easy. But when you're dealing with something like behavior recordings, right, you're usually analyzing about 100 different videos, and it's all people either bouncing from the page or going to the next step, and that is, to your point, very tedious. So the answer that I have usually is distribute that to the team as much as possible and give them a clear standard operating procedure of what to be looking at. So I act kind of more as a project manager on that front. And that allows me to not have to stare at 100 different behavior recordings. I might be staring at 10 and then having everybody else stare at 10 apiece. And I can do that in half an hour. That's easy. And I don't get bored about it, right? There's kind of a spectrum, right? There's on the one hand, there's analytics where you're kind of sleuthing things out and trying to understand the underlying story, which I find very interesting. Maybe others don't, which fine. That's why I have the job that I do. But then there's also user interviews where it's very fascinating and you're basically just listening for a living and you're trying to understand what makes people tick, which I've loved that for my entire career. That's why I come into the office every day. But then on the other hand, you get, piles of data that are difficult to synthesize. And that's when you either get other people involved or you hire an assistant, as I have, or you find some other way to kind of manage it, right? And there's got to be a way to skin that proverbial cat in a way that doesn't in a way that makes you still motivated to actually complete the work. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So basically, there's all this data, and you look for maybe ways to abstract it. So if you're looking for a specific thing, or you're looking for like a summary of what's in, say, like a user testing video, and that way you can see all these commonalities without having to sit through all that stuff.
Yeah, you want the takeaways, right? You want to know what to do, because it's not, I don't just watch videos for a living. I watch videos in order to make design decisions. And the goal is to be informed about the design decisions and come to some sort of decent hunch as to what it is that you should be testing next. Because there's something you mentioned earlier about like centering something or changing a button color. Those are generally low impact tests, right? And they're low impact tests not only because they're small things that you're changing, but also because that you may not realize you should be changing the button color, right? You run into this Dunning-Kruger thing where it's easy to change the button color, but you don't know that that's a bad idea. So user research allows you to kind of get past that and think about more crunchy, involved things to actually be changing on the page.
Awesome. And as you're explaining your thought process here, there's definitely sounds like a lot of like both sides of the coin, looking at those analytics, looking at the numbers, looking at the clicks, but then also talking to people to maybe uncover things that the clicks wouldn't tell you.
Yeah. And you have a hunch about why something isn't working the way it is, right? And so you do some research to try and figure it out. And that either answers the question or more likely it brings up more questions, right? And so you end up kind of acting as a detective. And it is more of a process than necessarily a like standard procedure that you follow, right? It's like kind of going through almost Socratic inquiry. It's like, but what about this? Why is this? And diving more and more into it and trying to get the core of the motivation.
And so having said that, I'm sure you must have some really cool stories where you had a client and maybe some of your assumptions were proven wrong, or the data led you to go in different interesting paths. So do you have any kind of cool stories like that to share with us?
Yeah, all the time. So there are things where I understand what's going on and I make a change and it turns out I was right. That tends to be the most frequent thing, which I'm very thankful and grateful for. There was one where I was talking to a few customers, and when you do customer interviews, you usually only do 5 to 7, because any more than that, you start to get like kind of the same results. It's kind of a diminishing returns thing. And I had 3 people all tell me that I should build this giant comprehensive configurator for this site. And they were like, that would be a great idea. And so we go and do it, and it takes 5 months of development work. Conversion rates tank. Cool. And I have to be the one sharing that to my client. I thought I was going to be fired. He kept hiring me for another year and a half. The whole point of it is not that you tried something and it failed, or that you change a process in the long run. It's that your process was probably okay. There might have been a few small tactical things you should have changed, or you should have questioned the thing that these 3 people were saying. But more importantly, you're educating the rest of the team about kind of rationally approaching something, right? And if it fails, then you learned something, and you're not just leaving it up there on your site forever. You tested it, it didn't work, you're hedging on risk, and you move on. So that's kind of a typical example of one of the like fundamental things that I teach my clients when I'm working with them, is that like the whole point of testing is to throw away bad ideas and keep good ideas. You can't have one without the other, right? Which means I'm going to make mistakes, and it means other designers that I work with, or the things that I'm researching, there are going to be mistakes. But the whole point of optimization is to keep what works and throw away what doesn't.
Right, and that's very interesting how you sort of focus group tested in a way, and then instead of just blindly implementing the idea and then letting it sit, you guys tested it so that you can be sure that, okay, this is a thing that people are saying they want, but then in actual practical use, it's not a good idea.
Yeah, and it could have been that they represented a traffic source that was interested in doing an interview. And that's one thing that happens, is you get a little bit of a selection bias. Like the kind of people who are willing to take surveys are the kind of people who are already interested in your brand and buying your product. That stands to reason. What I want to know is why people noped out of the whole process. And that is way harder to recruit for, right? So you get this kind of like groupthink that, an actual focus group is, I don't run those in order to prevent that from happening. And then you still go into it with the best of intentions and it messes up, which is fine. It's ultimately part of the process, and you learn from it and you move on.
Okay, well, fair enough. And so when I talk to some of these guys like you who talk about split testing or optimization, things like that, usually they say like their agency has some kind of minimum requirements, like some only work with e-commerce or some require like 30,000 visitors a month. So do you guys have any sort of limitations like that? Like, are there certain things, like if a company came to you and said, I want your help to improve the conversion rate of my website, are there certain things they have to have in order to work with you?
Bare minimum, you should be at least $1 million in revenue and 5,000 revenue generating transactions per month. And the latter is to get statistically significant A/B tests frequently. And frankly, you're hiring like a fancy consultant, so it should be worth your time and attention. So that's why the $1 million. Those are my kind of minimum boundaries. I've worked with SaaS in the past. The challenge with SaaS is that they usually don't get transaction volumes in the same level as e-commerce. So I favor stores, but if you run a SaaS and you're listening to this and you're intrigued and you get transaction volumes on the level that I'm describing, then we can have a conversation about it. But in practice, that tends to not be the case, especially for like fledgling SaaS.
Okay, fair enough. And we're still talking here, but do you mind dropping a link? That way if someone's listening and they're like, ooh, I don't even need to hear the rest of the show, I just need to go and contact Nick, where can someone reach out to you and your people?
Draft.nu is our business's site. And you can, there's email links and contact links all over that page. You can get a sense of what we offer as far as courses and books and stuff like that, and other podcasts that we've been on. And take a look there.
All right, super great. So draft.nu, if you were just like, okay, I need to just drop everything and go and talk to Nick and his team, draft.nu is the place to go. And so when you work with these e-commerce stores, people who have websites, I imagine that maybe sometimes is there like a little bit of a cleanup job there? Like when you have this client come on, like are there a lot of things that jump out immediately for you usually, or do you just look at it? Do you just approach it every new client and you say, I'm just going to test it, or do things jump out at you immediately?
Yeah, so if you were to hire me, the first thing that I do is basically a huge teardown of your existing funnel. And that involves just kind of analyzing like how people are behaving. We're running heat maps. We're taking a look at analytics. I'm usually fixing all the things that are broken on your Google Analytics to begin with, and getting everything into a good place. And part of that involves just kind of taking a look at what is working and what isn't. So for another example, there's a client I've been working with for the past 9 months or so. And when I first worked with them, I took a look at their site speed on analytics, and I'm like, okay, well, what's performing well? And it looks, mobile's conversion rate is 1/10 desktop. That's worse than usual. It's always bad, but it's worse than usual, and there's got to be a reason for it. Oh, on site speed, your average page load time is 15.56 seconds. That's like stage and intervention level bad. And so I took a look and found that they weren't compressing their images, that there were a few pages that were loading the same 1.1 megabyte JavaScript library 11 times, and all these things that were very obvious low-hanging fruit that we could be cleaning up. One page was side-loading jQuery 5 times, and they were different versions, and so it was this DOM loading disaster. And they just kept grafting on bad solutions, and they had a lot of code smell. So I went in, compressed all their images, removed all the redundant libraries just to begin with. We got the page load time down to 8 seconds, which is bad, but not stage and intervention level bad. Their conversion rate went up 9%. I made them about $500,000 extra dollars a year just by doing that. And that was just by cleaning up a disaster. I hadn't run a single A/B test yet. I hadn't even talked to their customers yet. And I probably paid for myself into perpetuity by doing that.
Super awesome. So I imagine that maybe some of these businesses, they end up in this situation maybe because they just kind of keep putting band-aids on the site, or they just keep hiring like kind of cheap programmers just to do a quick fix, and then maybe to have someone like you as a kind of an outside person to come in and look at everything that's been created, for you to come in like after the fact seems a lot more helpful, as opposed to maybe someone who's within the organization who's maybe too close to things.
Yeah, and I think that's at its best what a consultant is meant to do, right? Like, I think consultants get a bad name because they, take up a lot of money and they're, they don't know the organization, but that's actually an asset in these situations where I come in and I'm like, you have 50 Shopify apps installed that you're not using, right? Not only that, but I act as kind of a strategist and an expert who I can talk with your C-level about what your product strategy is and what your advertising strategies and what your inbound traffic strategy is, because I look at this. I've done this for 50 different stores over the past 3 or 4 years, right? And they're all very successful stores. Some of them are household name stores. And so I know a lot about what works and what doesn't. And I do that in a way that might be more experienced even than the C-level of the organization.
Right, and especially because you're maybe more technically, you have more like technical experience and maybe someone like that. So like you do know to look for how to clean up the Google Analytics, how to speed up the load time, how to prevent jQuery from loading 5 different times. You kind of can do both sides of things, right? You can do the business side of things, but then also go and fix up all that technical stuff.
Yeah, like cleaning up a disaster is, not exactly the reason I come in for the thinky side of things in my job every morning, but it's necessary, right? Like I will make money for your store by whatever means I see necessary. And if that involves, hiring an intern to run 25 megabytes of images through ImageOptim and Guetzli, like so be it. But the reason people hire me is frankly because I'm a consultant and not a contractor, and I act in a consultative way that handles the strategy and the more interesting thinky things that's why I love my job, is that I've been given a seat at that table so many times, and it's been really wonderful to just kind of think about the crunchier side of things with these business owners.
Yeah, that does sound exciting to jump into some new industry and some new business that's already rocking and rolling. And I imagine that. So what you're saying is that by you being a consultant, not a contractor, you're someone who can just jump into the business and try new things and come in with your own ideas, as opposed to someone saying, I don't know what to do. You give me ideas, I'll do the work.
Yeah, yeah. And towards that end, the disaster cleaning is increasingly fewer and further between. Like I have positioned myself such that I don't make bad stores good. I make good stores great. And that allows me to have clients that already understand how to compress their images. Like they've fixed the 101 level things. And if not, that's fine. We'll do it. There's no judgment. It's completely okay. We're gonna fix it. But man, I really love coming in and just kind of thinking through like more sophisticated 300 level problems with people.
So any interesting stories about that? Because like you said, it's one thing to go in and, do a bunch of quick cleanup, but it seems like that would just be kind of, I don't know, like not as fulfilling as being able to go on and make a cool like strategic decision or make a design or navigation change. So any interesting stories about where you went and implemented some really cool strategy or something?
Yeah, so I'm working with a rather large client that has, they're like a lifestyle brand, and they have a big Instagram strategy. I think they have like 700,000 followers on Instagram. It's something insane. But their mobile conversion rate was doing really poorly, which is not what you want when your biggest strategy is on Instagram, right? And you're a very visually oriented company that has like its own photography department and stuff like that. And so I looked at this and I thought, like, there's a mismatch here, right? Like most of your inbound traffic is mobile. I think it was 82% when they began to retain me, which is very high, and your conversion rate is a third. So that's the lowest hanging fruit. So I had to go and convince them that we should be doubling down on mobile first design. And so then I had to convey to their designers what it meant. Don't make desktop comps first, make mobile comps first. Think about touch states and not hover states. Think about tap target sizes. Think about cross-device sizes. Think about responsive, all of these things. And so I kind of set forth, they already had a style guide, but you add to the style guide by saying, here's how you do this within a mobile context. Here's how we're going to be running tests that are predominantly for mobile. So I don't think about desktop-only tests for this client terribly often, because it's only 18% of their customers and they're already the most wallet out. When your conversion rate is something like 9% there, like you're doing pretty good on e-commerce in that situation. And it was higher over Black Friday. So like I'm not too worried about that. And this was very much a case of identifying a conversion problem. You're not doing so well on mobile, and it is most of your traffic and attention, and attempting to fix it in a way that is simultaneously like putting on my front end dev hat and teaching people how to do responsive correctly, but also very strategic as far as like, how are we handling different inbound traffic sources? You have both Instagram and Facebook ads and Google search results, and you're getting featured on blogs and stuff like that. How are you handling these incoming customer segments? Are you doing it differently? Why not? Why, if so? Is that a good thing? Like, I don't know. All of these things are, more of the thinkier side of it, and it's far more interesting to be considering, you know?
Yeah, and what I'm hearing a lot from you is a lot of the thought process goes into not necessarily just saying, well, let's just do a bunch of stuff, but in looking at the big picture and saying, well, here's the low-hanging fruit. Here's here's where we're going to get the most bang for our buck. We're going to focus on just this one part of things as opposed to trying to do a little bit all across the board.
Yeah, and optimization, it's like you could do heuristic evaluations and understand like major conversion leakers, and that's a good thing to do kind of when you start or like right after you redesign, which is like a very common usability testing tactic. And I use that pretty often, but it's more interesting to, after you have done that or after you've taken a look at analytics, being like, okay, here's the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is different from other online stores in these particular ways, and here's why. And that's, again, me putting on my consultant expert, I've worked with 50 stores hat, which is something that you only learn from working with 50 stores.
Right. And I imagine that it sounds like you kind of, after a while, just kind of get an eye for this kind of thing. You know what to fix, what to do. You can kind of just by looking at it, since you've done this enough times, you just know what to do almost immediately.
Yeah, and you kind of know the shifting landscape of what works and what doesn't, right? Like when people start asking you, hey, let's do a call to action button color test, you have an answer prepared for them as to why that's a bad idea, right? And that is tremendously helpful, because if I just went along as a yes man and was like, yeah, let's do a call to action button test, it would fail and I wouldn't be viewed as well. Like there's two things that happen there, right? Like I'm not doing my job. I'm not earning my keep around the organization. And like, I'm coming along off like a contractor and not a consultant, which is not good for anybody.
Right. That's an important distinction. I like it. And also another thing that comes to mind with all this stuff is, a lot of these mobile things especially seem to change every couple of months. So do you have some kind of strategy on staying current on all the trends, all the things to know? Like, are you just naturally curious and you keep up to date on it every day? Or do you make it a point to like go to a boot camp every year? Or like, what do you do to just stay on top of all this cutting edge stuff?
I follow a lot of blogs. I talk with a lot of other e-commerce owners. Going to conferences helps a lot because you kind of learn from a lot of store owners, and usually I'm speaking at them too, which is great. Yeah, I mean, just kind of, staying like a social butterfly and reading a lot. Like, once you become an expert on this, also things find you. Like people have sent me like white papers that have been tremendously valuable, and that happens pretty frequently, and it goes both ways. Like I'll send other developers and entrepreneurs various pieces of literature. I do, research myself and work on my business and read a lot of books. Like it's all part of education, staying an expert on this, right? Writing books also helps you clarify your thinking a lot, right? Like you can't write a book and release it. I guess you can. You'd look like a schmo, but I try not to look like a schmo. You can't write a book and not research your thinking, right? And like fix, the logical holes in your arguments and such. So those are all the different things that I do.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so having said all that, like I imagine that if some of these companies, if they try to do the testings themselves, or maybe if a lesser consultant or contractor than you does testing, I'm sure that people tend to make maybe a lot of the same mistakes. So have you seen any just common issues that happen with testing? Is it not testing at all, or do they test stupid stuff, or what's the situation there?
Yeah, they test things that everybody else is testing because it's like case study porn. Like that's kind of what happens when you're starting out as an A/B tester. You read a case study for another site that worked tremendously well for them, and you think I should do that on my site. And so you test it, right? And that's how you get the call to action button color test, or like, I'm going to write a long form copy page, and you do it without thinking about the actual objections people have. And so it becomes this like, you have one foot in the testing pool and one foot in the move fast and break things world, and you aren't thinking rationally or clearly about customer motivations. And I get it. It's like this, you're still hooking into something that is familiar to you, right? But I think that's the key thing that trips up a lot of people, is they think that they can just come up with solutions really quickly. But I spend a lot of time researching. It's like probably 20% of my time is actually spent designing, running, and analyzing A/B tests. And the rest of it is spent talking with clients about what to do next, or researching new ideas. It's a tremendous amount of time and effort because you don't know what's going to work. And what works for one site might work for another site, but more often it won't, or the implementation needs to be finessed such that it's bespoke to that particular site. That's the big thing to take away from all of this.
Yeah, and I can totally relate to that, and I've been in that sort of situation myself when Google Website Optimizer, RIP now, but when that first came out, man, did I have a lot of fun with that, testing the orange button, testing the button with the red border, and when you hover over it turns green, all these silly things that all these people said, look, I tested it, you have to have this button that says free instant access now, and things like that. And so I can definitely relate to falling into that trap of testing the gimmicks, testing the little superficial stuff. And it sounds like you do more of a deep dig to make those better decisions and to really do a lot of research and think a lot before just testing something silly.
Yeah. I think the takeaway there is that, like, if I give you an A/B testing framework and I'm like, have fun, you will, because it's kind of fun to put together something and give 50-50 to your customers and see which one wins. But like, I don't know, I view it more as a tool, partly because I've been doing it for 5 years, and so all of the fun has been drained from it at this point. Like, I'm just viewing it as a tool in my arsenal and thinking more deeply about like what the design is. And also the motivation is like, if I don't pay back my fees by the first 3 months we work together, I fire myself. I fired myself from a client last week for the second time in my career. And it felt great, because I shouldn't be there. And it's very obvious whether or not I should be there when I'm doing something. And it's like, I made you this much money this month, right? Like, designers usually don't have the luxury of being able to say that. So if everything is stripped away, but trying to create a positive economic impact for the business, you're going to focus on that really quickly.
Awesome. Well, great advice. And what comes to mind is, what's that saying? When you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Yeah, that's kind of it, man.
Yep. So instead of going that way of just like adding all this chaos everywhere, figure out what the customers want, figure out what tests you can put in place to make it worth your while, to make it worth the cost and the time of doing that. And so if people are listening to all this and they love what they hear, they love all these ideas about A/B testing and trying out new terms and doing the user interviews and all that, where can, we already mentioned before, but let's mention it again. Where can they go and reach out to you and your team?
Draft.nu is the website. If you want to subscribe to my mailing list, you can go to draftsletters.com. I send along a weekly letter on optimization, testing, running business, life every week.
Super great. So drafts, is that plural, draftsletters.com?
Yes.
Cool. So draftsletters.com to get that weekly newsletter, and then draft.nu if you're ready to pull the trigger and hire Nick and tell him about your needs and see if you guys can work together to get some A/B testing figured out for your online stores, as opposed to just who wants to just let things sit there, because you never know what things your website is doing that is costing you sales. Like Nick mentioned, a bunch of different stuff, and a lot of that was load time or the mobile traffic was jacked, all these things that you yourself as a business owner might not even know to look for, or you hire just someone for a minimum wage or something, they might not know to look for that, but you get a specialist on your side, you get Nick to jump in and see where he can do the most for you, then Nick is the guy that you want to talk to. So go right now to draft.nu, and just for the sake of conversion and optimization, Nick, when they go to draft.nu, what should they click and what should they do exactly in order to reach out to you?
If you want to start working together, you can go to draft.nu, go to Draft Revise, which is the name of my offering where I run A/B tests for you on a quarterly basis. It's pretty glaringly obvious link right in the middle there. You go to draft.nu/revise if you're lazy, and scroll all the way down and mash the application button. Tell me a little bit about yourself, and we can begin a conversation.
Super great. So begin that conversation by going to draft.nu/revise, and we'll see you there. And thanks so much, Nick, for stopping by and sharing all these super amazing stories and all these great nuggets of wisdom about A/B testing.
Thank you so much for having me. I had a lot of fun.
Thank you for listening to Marketer of the Day. Subscribe and listen to other shows at marketeroftheday.com/episodes.